Audacious rebel.
If you go back into the past, go back 12,000 years, the people there were virtually living just by physical impulse. They were just living by instinct. You know, there's something big over there, it's got sharp teeth, and I don't want to be eaten by it. And so the things you are reacting to your environment. Where we tend to find ourselves today is that we tend to live through our emotions. And they tend to almost come first. It should be our thoughts that come first, but it isn't. It's our emotions that come first that then trigger our thoughts. But we are now transiting, as we are told by astrologers, into the age of Aquarius. And in the age of Aquarius, the concept of this sort of structured religion is falling away. If you just identify with everything that is material, then I think you are losing the probably the most important aspect of yourself, which is your conscious aspect, your consciousness aspect. That is really who you are.
Audacious rebel. There are some voices that don't just speak, they resonate. Not because they echo what we already know, but because there's still something ancient within us. Something we've forgotten. Dr. Kazim Kemal-ur-Rahim is one of those voices. He joined us in season 1 and left an indelible mark on the conversation. Not just because of his knowledge, but because of his presence. A presence rooted in stillness, depth, and a lived understanding of the sacred. A lifelong student and teacher of consciousness. Dr. Rahim's work span mythical traditions, psychology, spiritual anatomy, and the healing of deep collective wounds. His lens is both penetrating and expansive, able to reveal the hidden architecture beneath what we often take for granted. As we continue season 2, exploring the divine human, remembering what we are, it was only natural to bring him back. Because we're not just in a time of crisis, we're in a time of forgetting. And healing won't come from more information. It will come from remembrance, from reconnecting with what we truly are beneath the conditioning, the chaos, and the noise. Today, we dive into that sacred terrain. We'll be exploring the forgotten nature of humanity, the energetic and spiritual architecture that underlines our being, and how reconnecting with our divine essence could hold the key to both individual and collective restoration. Dr. Rahim, welcome back. It's an honor to journey with you once again.
Thank you very much, Bernard. I'm very pleased to be back. And also, I congratulate you on your first series. Well done.
Yeah, it was trying, but we got it. We got it done. You know, before we go deep into this conversation, I want to start with relevance. Why does understanding our spiritual and energetic nature matter to the average person today? And what is the practical value of this forgotten knowledge for us as individuals and for the future of our society?
Okay, where should I start? The first thing I would say is, how do you define yourself? Because if you look at yourself and say, well, I'm just a physical envelope that is aging, then you are where a lot of people are, where they just identify with materiality. And obviously, as that materiality changes, they feel that they are somehow losing a part of themselves. On the other hand, the very fact that you can sit and you can look at your organism and say, this is me and it is aging, it should be telling you that whatever is looking at that organism is not the organism. In other words, you're able to identify with yourself, but almost as a watcher of yourself. So that even though you say, well, I'm supposedly thinking out of my brain, you're still able at the same time to say, I am thinking out of my brain. And to do that, you're going to be thinking somewhere else to be thinking out of your brain. Can you see what I'm trying to say? There's something about us that is not physically connected to us. It's beyond us. Right. People call that consciousness. So if you just identify with everything that is material, then I think you are losing the probably the most important aspect of yourself, which is your conscious aspect, your consciousness aspect. That is really who you are. Now, One thing I will say straight away, because in esoteric thought, there is a tradition of saying, well, there is materiality and there's spirituality. And spirituality is often linked to consciousness, and that is somehow not material.
Right.
I don't come from that perspective. I come from a hylozoic perspective, which says everything is matter, but matter itself has consciousness. So wherever you are and wherever you define spirituality to be, it'll always be linked to matter. So to give something to the materialist, I would say, you don't have to leave matter to be spiritual, or you don't have to leave matter to say there's something more to me than just what I see before me, because you will always be in matter. But it just depends at what frequency that matter is operating at. And like, for instance, I can see visible light because it's at a certain frequency band that my retina can pick up, but I cannot see gamma rays. That doesn't mean they're not there. And that doesn't mean they're not made out of particles that are just as real as the photons that I'm seeing in my eyes when I see physical light. They're both there, but they're at different frequencies. And so I say, so what we could say is that we as humanity just somehow assume that we are in a physical frequency.
Right.
What I would put forward to you as a hypothesis is that actually we exist in many more frequencies than we can just see. And those frequencies are as relevant to us as the physical one. And I would say actually more relevant.
I said, why I asked the question, there's a school of thought that says, people may be interested in the spiritual stuff, but it's not important. Not recognizing the relevance to their actual lived experiences and all that we are experiencing on the planet. When we look at the state of the world, rising mental health issues, social unrest, violence, loneliness, what do you see at the root of this collective imbalance? What's driving this breakdown?
I think it's our focus. Take, for instance, your mobile phone. Mm-hmm. A person now is trapped into an ecosystem where they are being drawn down into something which is in front of them, which is material. They're not giving them the chance to expand their imagination, to put that phone down and to just look around them and see another beauty. When a poet looks at a tree, that poet sees something more than you and I see. You understand that immediately, because as soon as they start writing, you say, my God, I never saw that in the tree, but they did. They were seeing something beyond. And I think that's where humanity is getting sort of detached, because all we are seeing is our phone or what's in front of us, as opposed to allowing our imagination and our consciousness to go beyond the bounds of what is just there in front of us and realize that there's a lot more to life than what we can just see. And historically, we've always known that because we've had it in our spirituality. Go all the way back to, say, the shaman in a culture that is hunter-gatherers traveling around. That shaman would somehow tell his community that I'm in contact with something that you cannot see, but I can. They would have a tradition of eating magic mushrooms and things like that. And through that experience, they would see things. I am told, I've never tried it myself, but apparently you can see those things. So there is this other dimension that people have through experience actually come into contact with. And I think we now have lost that belief that there is something else. In other words, we have to say to ourselves, are we coming into matter or are we in matter going somewhere else? And if we're going somewhere else, where is that somewhere else? And how do we move along that journey? And I think that's where people are getting lost, because they're only seeing the material. And when things are not working in the material, they don't realize that there's more than just that. And by understanding that, they can balance themselves more equally, because they're recognizing more of themselves and then can work with a bigger palette of options than if you just see yourself as a material being.
That kind of ties into the next question. You're saying that, it's as if we're lost, but it's as if we are forgotten this essence of what we are. And what exactly have we lost or have we forgotten?
In our past cultures, and if you go back in time, now I'll work within what I call modern history. For me, modern history is about 12,000 years old. Everything in that sort of time span to me is incredibly modern, because I believe our history goes back a lot further. But as soon as you start going into that history, you start to lose people because they don't have any reference points they can grab onto. So let's just work with modern history. During that time, the mind of people, I believe, actually worked in a different way than it does now. Go back, say, 5,000 years, or go back, say, 8,000 years. They were much more intuitive. They worked from the back of their head, from that part of the brain where they sort of just almost understood things emotionally, somehow just absorbing things from the environment. What has happened over time? And you saw this really coming to fruition with the Greeks. They started to develop their rational brain, the front part of their brain. And so then things became mathematical. They became factual. You had to sort of prove things in sort of very definite ways. And so life began to change. And you can even see this in cultures. Some cultures are much more, you could say, mathematical and then others are much more philosophical. You could say this is the difference between the French and the English. The French are very philosophical and can argue the hind leg of a donkey. And the British just get on and build the bridge. They're not going to argue about the bridge and whether it's on this side of the bank or that side of the bank. They're going to build it, right? So even in today's modern cultures, you can see differences. But I'm saying that there was an even more dramatic difference between people of old and people of new. And you could even see this in the structure of society. If you were an Egyptian, say, 4,000 years ago, you were basically a termite. There was only one personality in the entire kingdom, and that was the pharaoh. And everybody else was just somehow an appendage to this one, individual. Where have we got to today? We've got to Gen Z or Gen X or whatever's the current gen that we're going on. And they couldn't give a monkeys about anything except themselves and the selfie they happen to be taking of themselves. So we've gone from a human being that couldn't even see themselves as an individual. In fact, if you go, I've traveled extensively in Africa, and sometimes I've worked in development. So I'd be going to people in their villages and I would say, who are you? And they would not even give a name. They would give their village name, their sort of tribal name. Their identity was the village, not themselves. Wow. Now, I was born in South Asia. And there, if you go and ask somebody who they are, they will give you the family name. Because for them, the family is their identity. If you go to a New York investment banker, he won't even give you his surname. He'll just give you his first name because he couldn't even care less about his family. It's me. This is me. This is who I am. And that's it. So there's been this transition of the human being going from a collective to an individual. Now you'd say, oh, that's a terrible thing. I don't think it is. I think it's a very good thing. Because I think for me, it's a progress into coming to understand yourself as an individual. Because that is actually very important. Because until you can actually dissociate and become separate and understand yourself, you then have the ability to reconnect, but reconnect in a different way, not losing your individuality. I remember watching an uncle of mine. He was the son of a Nawab. And so he was the heir to that sort of, dynasty. And he was 55 and his father walked into the room and he put his cigarette behind his back. He wouldn't even smoke in front of his father because there was this whole thing of that, you don't do this in the Eastern sort of family system kind of thing. Now, who would care less? You just smoke pot in front of anybody you like. We've come into a different world. I think, and in a way, this is what your series is about, is how do we reconnect from where we are now? Where are we going? And we accept where we are now, and I'm telling you, don't despair. We got here for a reason. Because that world where you were sort of lost and you didn't have an identity of your own is not where you want to ultimately be as a human being. You want to understand yourself. However, you then have to go forward from there and realize, although I am an individual, I actually am connected to everybody else. And through those connections, I have responsibilities and obligations. And there's a much greater wealth in my life because we are interacting with each other rather than just me being an island in myself, because that is not the best way to live.
I'm hearing so much in what you just outlined, Dr. Rahim. You identify at that time, we appear to be more intuitive. It's as though we were more in tune with our spiritual essence. However, at the same time, we lacked a personal identity. You also spoke about the evolution of what seemed to be a biological thing, where like the frontal cortex seemed to be more developed now than then. You spoke about the difference in culture and the influence it may have on our welfare and well-being. So, and you're saying at the same time we are in a much better place, even though we seem to have forgotten the essence and substance of what we really are.
I believe that we as humans go through an evolution. Now, if you talk about this in the terms of 70 and 10, to use a biblical phrase, it makes absolutely no sense. Because if you say you've somehow come from somewhere and you've come down here and you're going to live for 70 and 10, and then you're going to go away somewhere else. And depending on how you lived your life will depend whether you're in a very hot place or in a very pleasant place. If you follow that model, the question I would ask is, what would be the individual that came down 8,000 years ago be able to experience up there relative to you coming into wherever you're going to both end up at the same place for eternity? Because what you're going to bring with you is going to be incredibly different. Okay?
Big disparity.
Yeah. So I aspire to a different model. I say no. We don't just have a single experience in 70 and 10. We actually have multiple experiences, and these multiple experiences help us to grow and evolve, so that our consciousness, because that is the bit that actually sort of, you could say, is the bit that survives. And it does. And the point I also make is it survives in matter, not just as some kind of ethereal thing. That consciousness is what grows and expands. Because if you look at a termite in the mound and it has a queen at the center, that kind of model was the model of the Pharaoh in Egypt 4,000 years ago. The person that we have today is completely disconnected. But the person now who's beginning to realize that the rest of the planet is important to them, they're not an island, but they must work with the planet, is now beginning to expand their consciousness, because they're interacting with other people and saying, combined, we are somehow greater than the individual. And so there's a unity developing between individuals. Hopefully, I'm not saying it's there. I mean, America at the moment is an incredibly divided place, unfortunately, but it's got a good base to strike from. Okay. You're fed. You're not at war. You've got money at the moment. God knows what's going to happen in a few months' time, but you've got money at the moment. And so you can go forward in life and you can build. And I would say it's not even in this lifetime, it will be in future lifetimes. So what I'm trying to say is that over an arc of evolution, humanity has come from being a group, but not a group of individuals, but just a group, where perhaps a single individual in it somehow represented the group. So you could call that a group soul, right? We've then come down to an individual, where you have the New York investment banker is the best example of that. And from there, you will go on to becoming rather than a group soul, you'll become a soul group. In other words, you'll be a group of souls that will form a group. And you will form that group again, just as that other group almost operated like a single termite mound. You will be the same, but you'll be the same in a conscious way rather than an unconscious way.
Understood. So it's an evolution into a wholeness of all of society.
Hopefully.
Right.
And it'll happen, obviously, not with everybody, but groups will form, and those groups will get bigger, and they'll be more fractured in some countries and, more coherent in other countries. It's going to be a patchy thing, but I'm looking at tens of thousands of years, not just what's happening in the next few decades. Humanity will, I hope, if we don't blow ourselves up, go in that direction.
I hear you. I mean, when we look also, we got to pay attention to institutions like religion, media, the education system, and the role that they play, whether intentionally or intentionally. How do these institutions influence this evolution you're talking about, or does it perpetuate the spiritual amnesia that we identify?
In the past, I'm going back to Babylon now, people took offerings to a temple. They turned up with a cow or a goat or a chicken, and the priest would sacrifice that chicken, and there would be some kind of societal structure based on the exchange of chickens for some kind of favor from God. In other words, you take the chicken to the temple, the chicken is sacrificed, and somehow God's going to do something for you. That was one way of sort of thinking about your world. And that interesting thing there, why I bring that example up, is that you as an individual didn't think you could communicate with whatever was the other side or whatever you term to be God. You felt you had to go through a priest and a chicken to get to God, right? What is the modern person today doing? They're meditating. They're becoming mindful. They're sort of they're living in the now. They are becoming connected, and they're realizing that their path to whatever that something else is that is of value to them is an internal journey, not an external one. And this is actually exemplified very well in Islam, because in Islam you have the exoteric Islam, which is doing the 5 things that you're supposed to do, go to Hajj and you're supposed to fast and you give alms to the poor and these sorts of things. That, okay. But then you have another whole segment of Islam, which is called Sufism. And Sufism does all the other things, because if they don't, they get hung. And then at the same time, they go on this inner journey of finding themselves. And if you listen to their poetry or their songs, you realize they're talking about the love of something, but which is always in their own heart. In other words, God is in your heart. You find God there. You don't find God by going and sacrificing a chicken on an altar, or worse still, getting a priest to do it for you. So I think what's changed over time is humanity has evolved away from the group, believing in some kind of a group religion where there is a priesthood that somehow separates you from whatever there is outside. And from an astrological perspective, we would call that a Piscean way of looking at things. So for the last 2000, however many years, we've had this sort of Piscean sort of groups of religions. And those religions have also existed before that time, but in different forms. But we are now transiting, as we are told by astrologers, into the age of Aquarius. And in the age of Aquarius, the concept of this sort of structured religion is falling away, and it's becoming much more of an inward searching. And then people will come together based on that shared set of values, rather than a hierarchical structure where you have, popes and bishops and priests and things like that, and then you between whatever is the source and you. And so I think humanity itself is changing and going in the other way. And this is seen in the number of people that go to churches or things like that. Putting aside the Pentecostal movement, which is, one that is very active within the Christian faith, you'd say they are probably the most active. But if you look at the more structured religions, like in Britain, we've got the Church of England. They could fill probably, they've got thousands of churches, but they could probably only fill 3 every Sunday, because nobody's going to those churches anymore. Somehow that sort of structured way of somehow achieving your faith is not working for a lot of people. Now, that's not the case, for instance, in Africa. Africa, the churches are very vibrant there, but their societies are at a different level in their movement and structure. They're still coming very much from the rural place into the city. There's those transitions that we here did 200 years ago.
Right.
So therefore, the needs that they have for the different kinds. But one of the things that I found very amusing, which has also changed, I remember in a place like Ghana, and I was looking at the names of the churches. Every church had a fantastic name. The resurrected church of Jesus, the Savior of God knows what, and then there'd be another church with a different name. And besides being money-making enterprises in themselves, you realize that there was a need for faith and people were going to it, but they weren't doing it in a very structured way through, say, the Catholic faith, which is also very big in Africa, where you obviously have a big sort of bureaucratic institution that sits over the faith there. But also in Africa, strange enough, you've got all these Protestant denominations, and each one is basically a street corner vendor, which will be, selling a different, well, more or less the same story, but repackaging it, should we say, in a unique way to get their particular audience. So even that kind of religion has changed over time. But I would say, certainly for us in the West, I would say at least probably 50% of the population now is saying those kinds or those modalities of thinking about spirituality don't work for them anymore. Right. Now, some of them are lost and they're saying, well, that doesn't work, but where do I go? What is there for me? And some of them are reverting back into that and you're getting this with the masculine religion, blah, 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 which is very popular on a lot of podcasters at the moment. Okay, fine. If that's where you want to go there. But I would say that there is something else, and a lot of people are themselves beginning to explore. And then, the established traditions are sort of saying, oh, this is complete nonsense. These people believe in, say, for instance, astrology, or they believe in meditation and chakras. They're lunatics. And I'd say, excuse me, you believe in somebody who came out of a woman when she was still a virgin, and you're telling me that we're lunatics?
Yeah. You believe in somebody living in the belly of a whale for days.
Yes, that's right. So, I'm not saying either of us is right or wrong. I'm just saying, don't throw stones in glass houses. I remember somebody important saying that.
Yeah. Dr. Rahim, you spoke about, we are more than flesh. We're more than flesh and bones. We're more than thought. If we are energetic beings, what exactly makes up our spiritual and energetic architecture?
To answer that question, you have to come to a concept of how we're configured. I would argue from my matrix that I have constructed, which is a very old matrix, as you can see it in a lot of paintings of Hindu and Buddhist tradition. They show a being, and they have 7 focal points in their body, which are called chakras.
Yes.
Now, those chakras are considered to be energetic gateways between you and something else. Now, what is that something else? In the esoteric tradition, that something else is another envelope, and that envelope is called an etheric envelope. And that envelope is linked to your physical envelope because you can't live without it. If you took the etheric away, you would die. But that is saying, okay, the human being is immediately 2 envelopes. There's the physical envelope and there's this etheric envelope. But I would say that there's actually other envelopes as well, because beyond the etheric, there's an emotional envelope, and beyond the emotional envelope, there is a mental envelope. And I'm just going to stick with those for the time being because there are more as well. But so the human being for me is not a physical being. They are a collection of envelopes, and those envelopes are operating at higher frequencies, and they communicate to one another. Because for me, I do not think in my brain. I think in my mental envelope. And from that mental envelope, the thought has to get into my brain. So for me, the brain is just a router. It is just a junction box which sends those thoughts coming in from the mental envelope and spreads them out to my mouth, basically, or whatever, or to my brain as a cognizant thing and I'm thinking. Now, the challenge actually is that for the mental idea to get into my brain, it has to go through my emotional envelope, and then it gets colored, because obviously emotions can then take a pure thought, which is rational and calm, but then suddenly it gets all sort of het up with your emotions. So they call it not thinking clearly, right? So before it even gets into my etheric envelope and then condenses down into my physical brain, which then connects, to my senses. So that for me is what a human being is. There are a series of envelopes. Now, there is an envelope beyond the mental envelope, which in esoterics is called the causal envelope, and which in religious tradition is called the soul. That envelope is something that will store all that you've gained through all your past lifetimes. And so as you go through your lifetime, you will collect experiences which will eventually at the end of your lifetime be transferred back to that envelope, which is what you call your soul. But the other envelopes, which are your mental, emotional, and etheric, and then your physical envelope itself, are constructed each time anew. So that's new, but that soul part is what remains. Now, in esoteric traditions, even that disappears. But that's a much bigger story. We don't want to go there. But for the standard argument, or for the standard model, let's just say you have a soul and somehow that's permanent, which it isn't, but let's just take it as being permanent. And then you have your life, which is an impermanent structure. And what we've lost is that sort of concept that there are all these other parts of us that are beyond just the physical, and that will in fact remain when our physical envelope decays, so that we are not lost. Now that aspect of us, which is going back to the soul, is still a physical aspect, because it is still linked to let's call it an atomic structure. But because it's at a higher level, we have historically in our literature described it as matter and spirit. So we say that, but as a high resolution, I say there's matter and there's more matter, but it's more refined and
Yes.
vibrating at a higher
Vibrational states.
frequency. But
Yeah.
we'll call it spirit. It's a good enough thing. And this actually comes into the whole thing about the Trinity, because the Trinity itself says there's the Father, there's the Son, and there's the Holy Ghost. What you're seeing there in itself is a series of ladders of refinement. You have the Father, which is supposed to be God. You've got the Son, which is supposed to be Jesus in the Christian tradition, and you've got the Holy Ghost, which is somehow something that animates life down here. That is a metaphor for me personally of you. You are the Father, and you are also the Son, and you are motivated by the Holy Ghost. In other words, there's this thing about matter, consciousness, and this higher spirituality, you could say. So these are all allegories. So we have them in our religion where we have the Father somehow being God. For me, that is not God. For me, the Father is, you could say, the highest aspect of myself. However, that is not where I am, and not because esoterics sometimes get a bit sort of lost in itself. Where it says, okay, well, this part of myself knows everything, but I'm stupid. I say, no, you are just stupid. What you're trying to do is evolve your consciousness so that you can go back towards this higher level of vibration, which is always there, but at the moment is not functioning in itself. It's sort of sent itself down to learn, to come back to itself with experience and knowledge and wisdom. And that to me is the whole evolution of humanity. We're going back to our Father. But you go back to the Father through the Son being a stage of evolution. And again, I don't want to get into technicalities of it. So, and then again, this causes problems in religion because it says I think it's in Matthew or something, I'm the truth and the life, and you come to me, to go to the Father, you come through to me, sort of thing.
Right.
Which then says, oh, well, the only Christians go to heaven. No, that's not what's
Right.
being said in an esoteric perspective. It's saying that there is a pathway of consciousness evolution where you go through this sonship, I'll call it, to get to this higher level of fathership. And so you've got to go through that to get to that. People have then said in the exoteric faith structure, that is a person, and it's only that person that can do it for you. And therefore, unless you believe in him and his sacrifice, you go nowhere.
Right.
Now, immediately you've got a problem. Immediately you've got a division, because there's a whole
Yes.
bunch of people called Muslims that have another set of faiths. There's a whole bunch of
Yes.
people called Hindus that look at things in a completely different way. And yet we're all supposed to have one Father.
Yes. And I'm glad you mentioned that. And there's two questions come out of that. Now, one, there are different beliefs, different human beings with different ideas and concepts, which immediately have them ostracized if we take the perspective that religion perpetuates. This is a question I've had. This is something a thought that came to me. Regardless of what you believe, all our bodies function the same way. Our hearts, regardless if you're a Muslim, you're a Hindu or atheist, it functions the same way. Your lungs, your kidneys, your pancreas, they all function the same way. And to me, if there's a spiritual dimension to ourselves, then that too should function the same way in spite of what you believe. A lot of you have shared goes back to Eastern teachings. You spoke about the chakras and, the esoteric and Eastern philosophies. But do we have any information that can tie these teachings to contemporary science?
We're beginning to get there slowly, and it started probably in the 1930s with a Russian scientist called Kirlian, because he took highly charged electrostatic plates and he took photographs of leaves and hands and things like that. And he
Yes,
began to see that there was this sort of energy field around all living matter, right? And then when he started taking pictures of things like the body, he noticed that there were points of light dotted around the body. And some bright spark came along and looked at that picture, and then looked at a picture of a chart of the acupuncture points and said, hey, look, these points of light actually correspond to what's on this chart. So this tradition, which is thousands of years old from China, somehow knew about these energy focal points within the body, which we can now see with science, with a photograph. And they knew about it already and were dealing with it as a whole sort of group, a whole section of medicine. So science is sort of catching up and finding a proof to the fact that something has always existed and has been known about in an ancient tradition. Now, Some people claim to be psychic and have certain abilities to see things in other dimensions, which most people can't. Those people claim that they can see these points of light. And it's probably the people with that skill originally that formed the medical practice that became acupuncture without having the benefit of having electricity. They could take photographs, they could produce an image. And what they also knew, and this gets back to that thing about intuitive thinking and the sort of connection to higher things that we had in the past, they knew that meant something. Because, the Kirlian photograph will just say that there's an energetic field that we're seeing, and that there seem to be these nodes in it. But what do those nodes link to? That's not giving you the next step. Whereas if you go back to our ancient tradition, they knew what that next step was. They knew what was the other side. They knew they were trying to connect something to something else. And then they developed a whole code of medicine around it, which people still use to today. I mean, I've seen open heart surgery done, and the person was only anesthetized with needles. And that's amazing. You think, wow.
So when you get into things like energy work, Reiki and whatnot, there is a lot of scientific fact and relevance where these things are concerned.
Well, we can certainly show that there are these energy field fluctuations. And the other interesting thing about these energy fields is that when you're feeling well, the fields are expanded. And when you're not feeling well, the fields are contracted. So immediately we know something about this field, which we in the esoteric tradition call the etheric field, that it is linked to our well-being. And then that immediately brings up the question, well, then what makes it contract? You ask that question immediately, because then that's really crucial, because when you're not feeling well, field is contracted. We can measure that. And when you're feeling well, it's expanded. So then you look into your world and say, what are the kind of things that contract it? Well, one thing that contracts it is, for instance, stress, right? And when you are stressed, what do? You become sick. And we know that the strong etheric field is what keeps you well, because that's what acupuncture is all about. It's about strengthening those fields so that you become well again. So then sort of not sleeping, being stressed, you find that the field contracts when you drink alcohol. You find it contracts when you smoke cigarettes. It certainly contracts when you take drugs. So immediately, if you had 3 brain cells in your head capable of communicating to one another, you would say, taking what we know about these fields, which we can show from these plates, photographs, that they expand and contract when we do certain things, and surely we must then live our lives in a certain way that doesn't allow that to happen. We do things that are positive rather than negative. We live for the wellness of our being, right?
But then, most of us are not even aware of what that means, because how we have been conditioned to live.
True. I mean, okay. I mean, Dunkin' Donuts is obviously,
I don't know why you call Dunkin' Donuts.
I don't know, because I've never had one. I just know the name. And I was walking down a street in New York, and quite literally 50 yards, there was a Dunkin' Donuts. And I was thinking, my God, you mean the person couldn't go from here to here without needing another Dunkin' Donut to carry on walking down the street?
Something, you just also went into the next question, because what I wanted to find out is, how does this connection from that architecture manifest in our real life? You did mention how this energy field contracts, and how does it affect the body? How does it affect our minds, our relationship, when this inner network is ignored or blocked?
Well, we can ignore it, and it doesn't matter, because the network basically is automatic, right? You ignore your heart, but it keeps beating, right? But we do know also that if you do certain things in your life, you can damage your heart.
Right.
And that's where we've got to make the connection. So we are functioning through these envelopes I'm talking about, through these chakras I'm talking about, and it's all happening automatically. Where I believe you can go, if you begin to study this process and make your life balance with it, you can improve the quality of your life immeasurably, because you are then working to improve those connections all the time. So for instance, okay, I'm a new age sort of weirdo, but every night when I go to bed, I balance my chakras, and I do it with crystals, right? That's just what I do. I haven't had a cold for decades. And people are always I just don't have them. Why? Because I'm making damn sure that my chakra fields are very strongly protected. They're working as best as I can make them. I can't stop myself growing old, but I am growing old gracefully. I'm 63, nearly 64, and I don't take any tablets. I'm on no medication. Now that puts me in a minority for people.
You go riding every day,
Yeah. So the point is
miles.
that if you look after yourself and you, I mean, when I say I don't take tablets, I do take supplements and like sort of vitamin D and things like that, because we realize that we need those things in our life, but I don't take any drugs of any sort, pharmaceutical drugs.
Right.
So yes, I think we've got to live a life where we acknowledge that we are more than just the physical, and that we can, through certain techniques in our life or the way we live our life, the food that we eat, the way that we control our rhythm, which is how much sleep we get, and how we allow stress to affect us. For instance, people do get stressed, and I quite often say to them, if you are stressed, imagine yourself standing there and then step to the side and look back at that space where you stood and realize that that is the stress and that you're now looking at it and it's not you. Separate yourself from it. And if you do those kinds of activities in your daily life, you'll find that you will de-stress yourself a lot, because you will realize that what you think is you and what you think is going on with you is not really you, and is not the main thing. You are somehow there's a play going on stage, and you are effectively somebody in the audience. Don't make the mistake of thinking you are the actor. The actor is just a vessel through which you project your persona, your personality, your ego, whatever you want to say, to the audience. But that actor, that part, is not really you. And if you can detach yourself from that, then a lot of the stresses and travails that come in your life, you can then see in a different way, and then they don't quite wash over you in the same way. And in the same way, you can also look at that if you have another concept of your life, and that's of karma. And that is saying that things are happening for a reason. That's not to be fatalistic, which they do a lot in India. They say, oh, well, my God, I can't help this. I was born like this, and therefore I'm going to have to remain like that. No. What it is saying is that things are there as teachers. Everything that happens to you. If somebody is really mean, you've got a really mean boss. Go up to him and thank him and say, thank you. You're teaching me something really valuable. I appreciate you in my life. It may cause him to have a heart attack, but I mean, the point, what you're trying to say is that interaction, whatever is going on, whatever the tensions are, it is something that is making you wiser through it. If you see everything as that, as a learning process, as something that makes you stronger, rather than being a victim, then your life will become very much more positive. And if you become more positive in the way you think, your energy field expands. And if your energy field expands, you protect yourself more from illness. And because you're not ill, you feel better, and therefore it expands even more. It's a positive feedback loop. Whereas what we've tended to get ourselves into is a negative feedback loop.
You've mentioned that this type of living, either we have forgotten it, it has been lost. What keeps people from remembering this? Is it fear? Is it our conditioning? Or is it that we've become too distracted by survival to notice that sacred aspect of ourselves?
If you look at most people today, they live in their desire body, their emotional body. Okay? If you go back into the past, go back 12,000 years, the people there were virtually living just by physical impulse. They were just living by instinct. There's something big over there. It's got sharp teeth, and I don't want to be eaten by it. And so the things you are reacting to your environment. Where we tend to find ourselves today is that we tend to live through our emotions, and they tend to almost come first. It should be our thoughts that come first, but it isn't. It's our emotions that come first that then trigger our thoughts. And so that's where most people are today. What we're wanting to try to get to is where we have mental determination. And I think that's where people have got lost. They are not determining their lives. They're riding on a sea of their own emotions.
So they're reactive.
Yes, it's very reactive rather than active. And activity starts from thought. And there's a term that we use there. It's called willpower. Right? It's the ability to walk past that Dunkin' Donut shop and not go in. Right? Your emotions will take you in. But through willpower, you will walk past it. you see? And that's what we've got to develop. Now, we've lost that, partly because our traditions don't really, I mean, for instance, the tradition of churches says, oh, well, you go to church, you pray, you've got a soul, and as long as you give your tithe to the church and you don't do too much harm, we'll absolve you at the end of your life and you'll go to heaven. Fine. But in all of that, in a way, you're almost disconnected. What people need to realize is that you've got to be in that process of going to heaven all the time, because heaven isn't somewhere else. It's right here now. It's what you make of it inside yourself. It's how you live your life. Don't think tomorrow is going to be all right. And I don't care if they're sort of hammering me on my head today. No. You've got to, and don't say that's my karma either. You've got to strive to be better. You've got to strive to move your life forward. But you've got to do it in a way that realizes that it's your effort and that it's by your own effort that you will achieve something. Now, we've lost this link in some respects to spirituality. But on the other hand, as I said, the modern human being does meditate. They do, think that there's more in life than just their physical. It's just, do they leave enough time in their day to make that happen? And do they allow the other things in their life to have too much importance in their life? Because they say, yeah, I know I've got to make some quiet time and just sort of sit and relax, but I can't do it right now because I've got this deadline and that deadline, and then they forget about it. Well, this comes back again to willpower. What are the things that are important to you? What are the things that you're going to value going forward? You've got to make that effort. And you can't blame it on society. It's up to you individually. And we've got more opportunity today to choose our path than we ever had before. You go back 200 years, you were a Protestant somewhere in Boston or something like that, and if you came out with a sort of a more sort of a vegan friendly diet and a different way of living, they'd have burnt you at the stakes as a witch, right? Whereas today you can do all sorts of things in your own time, and people will leave you alone, more or less.
Then you talk about actually making time for ourselves and not being caught up in survival mode or distraction. But how significant do we really recognize the significance of that aspects of ourselves?
Unless you are blind and deaf, there is enough information being fed your way to alert you to the fact that these are issues and you should be doing things about it. I mean, even the sacred mobile phone you're holding in your hand even has apps on it that are wellness apps and meditations. Even in your material existence, there are tools there that are supposedly there to help you achieve some other altered state inside yourself that is supposed to be beneficial. So you cannot claim that that isn't there. And there still are the traditional structures of church and family and things. I mean, one thing that has happened, unfortunately, is that the family unit itself has become much more fractured. If you look at us in the past, we lived in originally very small family groups. Those were the hunter-gatherers. And everybody lived together. And then those hunter-gatherers eventually came together through agriculture into villages, and then from villages into towns and cities. So we became a sort of more coherent group of people all living together. But we still lived within a smaller family structure, even in those larger structures. And there was support for us. There was support in the sense that you were there with your siblings who were married to other people, and they had children, you had children. The children were all sort of coalesced and corralled and somehow lived in this group. Now, everybody was supported in that way. The modern family today can be very often, 50% of the time, be completely fractured. The two supporting structures that brought it together are no longer together. And one part of that supporting structure, usually the woman, is then responsible for then somehow creating, a life for her dependents. And often she may be actually remote from her other family support structures because she has moved to another city or something like that. So then again, she's broken things down. And in that kind of environment, and this is a part of the things that you probably examined very thoroughly in your first series, where have things gone wrong that have caused the social problems that come from that? The support that we should be getting around us is no longer there. And then it becomes very difficult for the individual to find their way because they're struggling to survive. Yes. And they're struggling with the responsibilities and they have nobody to turn to. And quite often they'll turn to alcohol or they turn to drugs or whatever. This is the sad sort of downward slope which you see in some people. Not everybody, but it's there and it's very visible. Or homelessness because their mental sort of balance is completely broken down, and they then just go and live on the street. A lot of those people have serious mental issues.
Yeah, you're speaking there, Maslow and his hierarchy of needs come to mind, because while I'm struggling to stay alive, I can't be thinking about self actualizing. I can't think about meditating when I'm hungry.
In the modern world, yes, but in the past, there, in a way, funnily enough, that meditation was given out to the priest. The priest did the meditation for you, or the shaman in even older societies, and you then you concentrated on surviving. What's changed now is that you have to do both things. You have to be the priest and the person that feeds yourself and clothes yourself and does all those things. You can't just be the worker ant supporting the queen, at the center of the nest. You got to do all of those things yourself. And I agree, it is very difficult. But what every individual has to come to realize is, until they themselves understand that they have to focus from themselves outwards and then make alliances to survive, because you can't stand alone. Standing alone is not the way forward. The way forward is back to a form of a greater unity, but as an individual, working with other people, realizing that by working with people, you serve the community, and the community gets stronger.
Dr. Rahim, what would you recommend to someone just beginning to feel that call inward? Are there practices, mindsets, or environments that can help reawaken this memory?
The first thing I would say you could do is watch yourself. That you start with that. They call it mindfulness, right? In other words, always look at yourself when you do anything. See yourself almost from outside yourself. When you're talking to somebody, don't just talk to them, but think how they are seeing how you're talking to them. In other words, reverse the position and become the listener, not just the talker. So then you start judging everything you do, saying, well, did I act kindly then? Was I being selfish? That's where you start. Okay. The next thing you do after that is you set aside a period of time in your day, which I would say is no more than 10 minutes. And you then sit and you find a quiet space and you let your mind just relax. And that's what we call meditation. Now, there's the meditation centers like Vipassana, where you go and you sort of meditate for 10 hours a day. I would say absolutely don't do that. That is absolutely disastrous.
10
From
hours a
a
day.
direct perspective, don't do it, right? I'd rather shoot heroin into my veins than go and meditate for 10 hours, right? It destroys your etheric web and you just don't want to do it. So, but 10 minutes a day, yeah, that's great. And if you can't do 10 minutes a day, 5 minutes a day, but do it at the same time. Give yourself just that amount of time in a day, right? To just quieten yourself down. And then it'll slowly expand out to 10 minutes, and maybe it'll go a bit longer than that, but no more than 20. But, the point is, what you're doing is you're allowing your mind to empty and see what happens. What kind of downloads do you get? That's where you begin to connect. Then the level then beyond that is what we call contemplation, where you will take a theme and you will think about that theme in that quiet time, and you will allow that theme to sort of float around inside your sort of mental envelope, and see how you sort of begin to understand that concept better. I use that a lot when I sort of have a problem. I'll put it out as a contemplation, and suddenly I'll get a download, and it won't necessarily happen the same day. It may happen days later, but then suddenly the complete answer comes. And it's a good idea to have a pen and paper to quickly write that down and think, yeah, that's what it was. Now it makes sense to me. At the time it didn't, but now it does. Now, eventually, I'm talking about beyond that, there are methods by which you can then take this sort of development of this higher consciousness further. But that is then going into walking what was known as the path. It's the path of initiation, but we're not going to get into that. That's PhD stuff. You don't want to go there now. What you're trying to do is just get yourself into a place where you are first mindful of yourself, become aware of yourself, appreciate yourself, and in that way appreciate others. Then put aside at the same time every day a certain period of time. I would suggest no more than 10 minutes, where you allow your brain just to quieten completely down, switch your phone off. And then you go on eventually to contemplate, where you will take topics and themes which you think you want to sort of think about, and a question that you may have, and then you find information, you let it sort of float around inside your brain, and you will be amazed at the kind of answers you'll get from yourself. It'll somehow just drop into your mind.
Dr. Ram, can you share a bit on meditation itself? I mean, there's so much people saying so much different things about meditation and types of meditation and how it should be done and what is it really. What really is meditation and how should this be done?
The thing about meditation is that there are many different ways of achieving the same objective. Some people will focus, say, on a candle, and they'll just sort of try to sort of focus on a piece of light or something like that, or a statue, right? And they'll let their mind sort of go blank and somehow just think about the statue. Other people will repeat rosaries, Mother Mary, this, that, and the other, or some kind of, some kind of Rengi Kyo, whatever. There's, Buddhist tradition
Like a
of saying that.
mantra.
Yeah, a mantra, right? You go in and do those sorts of things. So that's one way and what you're doing, in fact, is actually switching your brain off by doing something repetitive. And because you're concentrating on that, all the other extraneous things just disappear. So that's one way of doing it. Then you have transcendental meditation, which I've never understood what it is. And then you have things like where you somehow quieten your brain, but you've got to be prepared. You see, I think if you try to meditate, you can't.
Right.
You've got to somehow allow your mind to sort of become quiet, and then you'll have these thoughts going through. But what you're going to not do is hold on to them. Because then it becomes, you're just losing the plot, because you're always chasing these thoughts, or you're saying, no, go away thought, I don't want you there. No, let the thought be. It's got its own life. Let it exist. Let it come through your brain and go at that side, but don't pay attention to it. Just let it go. And I think that's the way you meditate. You do it by just allowing your brain this peace and quiet, and then just seeing how it develops. If you set yourself a task and say, I'm going to achieve illumination in 3 months, or I failed completely. No. You're not going to do yourself any favors. Now, there are different methods of meditation, and I would advise anybody to go and use, Google or whatever, look up the different schools and see what resonates with you. All I would say is, for God's sakes, don't do Vipassana. That to me is completely toxic, because I listened to a podcast that was done, I think it was done by the New York Times, about this, and the number of people that have committed suicide after doing that. And I thought, yikes,
Wow.
And then I spoke to people who've done it, and they said, yeah, we know that about that. It's in this, that, and the other happened to me. And I thought, really? And you're doing that? I know other people swear by it and they say they're transformed and they're able to walk on water, fine for them. But I say, if you're doing something where a certain percentage of them actually end up killing themselves, there's something wrong with the system.
Is it possible, though, to live as a divine human in a society that functions from disconnection, or functions from fear, and driven by materialism? This is our society. How, in this sphere, can we actually live as a divine human?
Well, the first point I would say to you is that everything is divine. There is nothing around you, from the humblest rock or pebble to you, that is not divine. Because everything comes from a source, and that source is divine, therefore everything is divine. So the first thing that I would say is, don't somehow differentiate yourself from anything else, because again, you're immediately making separations. Realize that everything is connected. Because you say, oh, well, I'm a human being and a rock is just a rock. And I say, inside you, there's potassium, there's sodium, there's this, silicon, there's carbon. These are all minerals. And without those minerals, you wouldn't even have a body. So don't go around putting your nose up at minerals, because minerals is what gives you a body, right? And so everything that is us and is around us is divine. What you're talking about is it easy to be a mindful person, a person that is more aware of these sort of more refined aspects of life, to live in a world that is so discordant? And I would say it is difficult, depending on where you are. If you, for instance, decided to start meditating and considering higher aspects of spiritual life, and didn't conform to a very strict religious code, which may be what is part of your community, you may be in big trouble. And that is why a lot of these traditions were secret. because people would have these times of thinking about themselves inwardly in a spiritual way, but they realized they couldn't do it in public. Otherwise, they would be shunned by the public as being different. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you got to realize that you are going to be in discordant places, but you can protect yourself. And this comes back to the thing I mentioned about chakras and balancing them. Because whenever I go into a place which I know is going to be discordant, I just say to myself, I just imagine a protective shield around me of blue light. And then I go into that place. And then I don't get affected by it. Where some people can go somewhere and they can come back feeling very drained and sort of worn out by the place. I don't, because I'm in this shield. That doesn't mean I'm not communicating with people, interacting, being out and about, but I'm not letting that impinge on me. The third thing I would say is think about what you do. My daughters introduced me to this game when they were young. I mean, they're women now, 35, and it was called Tomb Raider. And they didn't want to play because it frightened them. So they said, Dad, you play it, and we'll sort of shout and scream behind you as every time the dinosaur comes around the corner. So anyway, I was playing it like that. And then as the game iterations came out, this game got more and more realistic. And then, to the point where I couldn't play it anymore because I could never manage these controllers. The thing went one way and I was wanting it to go the other way. I could play it on a computer, but not a controller. But the thing is that I was watching these things, and there were two things that struck me. When the person, Lara Croft, died, it was dreadful. Spikes went through her and blood splattered everywhere. And then I was looking through the sight of a gun, and I was shooting somebody dead. And then I thought to myself, hang on a second. I've just shot somebody dead, as though it didn't matter. And somebody gave birth to the person I just shot dead. Somebody changed that person's nappies, burped them, put them to sleep, sent them to school, and I've just shot them dead, and I couldn't care less about it. Can you see what I'm trying to say?
Yes.
We have brutalized ourselves in the very world we live in the very computer games we play, and the things that happen there, Call of Duty and things like that. You're going around massacring people as though it doesn't matter. Every person you massacre in that game was born through a womb in your virtual world.
Yes.
And yet you were just able to kill them without thinking. So I would say to people in this world that is like this, think about what you're doing. And don't put yourself into those situations and into those places which are discordant. If you're going into a rave where, for a start, you've got flashing lights, you've got very loud music, and people are taking all sorts of nefarious substances, why are you doing that to yourself? You can't say, oh, well, the world is terrible and, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm afraid you voluntarily paid money to go to that place and do that to yourself. Mm. So, whatever the outcome is from that experience, own it.
Take responsibility.
Yeah, take responsibility. Use willpower. So that's what I would say. How do you be divine? Well, I say you are divine, so don't worry about that. That's a given. But how do you survive in a world that is discordant? Well, I would say make choices. Make choices and protect yourself.
We've been speaking already for an hour, Dr. Rahim, and I'm really enjoying this conversation. This could go for another hour. I want to give you that space to speak freely, though. If you could share one message from your heart to all who are listening right now, what would you want them to remember?
I would say remember that you are immortal, so that nobody can take away from you that immortality. Because one thing that religion has done has said that, oh, if you do something wrong, you will go to hell. And it's interesting because you will go to hell and you will suffer there forever. That means that God can't snuff you out. You have to be there forever. Because if I didn't like somebody, I just snuff them out. Why do I have to put them somewhere, right? And so there's something about us that is actually immortal. Recognize that. You are immortal and you have value. And whatever it is that you want to call God is inside you. Don't go searching for this God outside you. But remember, the way that you find that God is through service. Because if you live your life just for you, saying, okay, well, I'm divine and God's inside me, therefore I should just live for myself. No. That's not how it works. It works by recognizing that you are divine. And if you are divine, then everybody else is divine. And if you say, oh, well, I worship God and I love God and I respect God, I say, well, why did you just be mean to that person? Because if you're divine and God is supposedly important, the same God is inside that person. You were talking about you have livers and you have hearts, you have pancreases. Well, the same God made that person has made you. And therefore, they are your brother or sister. And so I would say that realize that although you are totally unique and of yourself, you are also your responsibility in life is to serve others selflessly. And if everybody did that, the world would be a completely different place. Completely different.
I say that all the time. We don't need no G summit and conferences and world leaders. You just need people to be nice.
Yeah. Yeah. And to realize that whatever makes you tick makes everybody else tick. And this comes back to that single golden rule: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. You can't get more than that or less than that. That's it.
Dr. Ram, let me thank you so much for once again illuminating a path that many have forgotten, but all of us are being called to walk. To those listening, this conversation wasn't just about theory. It was an invitation, a reminder, a mirror. If you felt something stir within you today, don't ignore it. Lean into it. Because remembering isn't about becoming someone new, it's about reclaiming who you were before the world told you who to be. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. Click the notification bell, and more importantly, share this conversation with someone who needs it. And I also want to invite you to visit the Audacious bookstore. You'll see it on the link below. Because awareness begins with information, and the right book at the right moment can change everything. You'll find works there that support this journey from consciousness to culture, from the sacred to the scientific. Until next time, remain present, remain powerful, and remain audacious. I'm Gurman, and this has been the path of the Audacious Rebel. Audacious Rebel.